The stone wasn't a headstone. It was a warning. Rough slate, pushed into the dirt at a crooked angle, with one word scratched in deep, trembling lines. Sinner. No name, no date. No one wanted to remember, or be remembered. Caleb Rusk stood beside it without dismounting, just stared from the saddle, silent, the brim of his hat shading eyes burned dry from years of sun and smoke. After a long pause, he swung his leg over and touched down slow, his right knee catching, like always. The grave was shallow. A day's wind could uncover it. The dirt hadn't been packed, just pushed into place with a boot. He could see where the rocks had been scattered around to keep the coyotes out. Not out of mercy, but necessity. 2 wagon tracks veered away down a slope. One was fresh. The other, older, almost lost to the sand. Between them, scraps of fabric, a length of frayed rope and what looked like a child's shoe, half covered in dust. Small, worn. He picked up the shoe and turned it slowly in his hand. Apache made, Chiricahua style, beaded in blue and white glass, though most of the beads had fallen off. He held it for a moment, thumb on the sole, then set it down with care. Something about the placement of the grave. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, tucked between 2 large rocks, where the earth dipped slightly, out of view from the road, hidden but not forgotten. He read the word again, sinner, not carved with reverence, with rage. He crouched, one knee pressing into the dry earth, and brushed the dirt around the stone with his bare hand. There were no flowers, no offerings, but someone had left something else, a single owl feather, black with a white tip, tucked beneath the edge of the stone. A warning. Apache women sometimes used it when a death wasn't natural, or wasn't just. He looked up at the ridgeline. No movement, no birds. The land was holding its breath. He didn't speak, not even a whisper, just reached up and took off his hat, held it against his chest. His fingers were calloused, stained from saddle leather and campfire ash. He had nothing to say, but still stood like someone who'd heard a name he recognized. He stayed there a long time. Then, without ceremony, he walked to the horse and unlatched a worn spade strapped to the saddlebag. He returned to the grave and began to dig. Not over her, beside. He wasn't trying to uncover the body. He'd seen too much death already to disturb it again, but the ground tells more truth than men, if you know where to look. The first few inches were dry dust, then clay, then something softer, ashes, burned cloth. He set it aside. Farther down, he hit a metal object. He knelt and brushed it carefully. It was a cooking pot, bent, blackened, and inside it, more cloth, folded, preserved. He pulled it out gently. It was red, trimmed in turquoise thread, singed at the corners, but intact. Not just a sash, a ceremonial wrap. Young women wore it during rites of passage, girlhood to womanhood. It had taken time to make, love, patience. Someone had buried it with her, someone who cared. He stood and held it up to the light. The fabric fluttered, catching the sun like blood through smoke. That's when he heard it. A stone tumbling. Small, but close. He turned, quiet, and listened. Breath shallow. A boy stood at the ridge. Barefoot, lean, no more than 9 or 10. Hair tied back in a leather cord, skin dusted with red clay. Apache. He didn't run. Their eyes met across the distance. The boy lifted one hand, not a wave but a gesture, a sign of mourning. Then he disappeared behind the rocks. Caleb didn't move for a long time. He folded the sash, tucked it carefully into his coat, and refilled the shallow trench he'd made. Covered it with the same dirt and same silence as before. He left the stone standing. As he mounted the horse again, he glanced once more at the crude letters. Sinner. He knew what kind of people carved that word, and he knew better than to believe them. He turned the horse toward the valley and began to ride, the dust rising in his wake. Behind him, the grave returned to stillness, but now it wasn't alone. She was 17 when the preacher's wife slapped her, not with anger, with quiet purpose, in front of the whole chapel. Maria Nantan stood still, a line of blood curling from the corner of her mouth, eyes fixed on the wooden cross behind the pulpit. Her braid had loosened in the scuffle, strands falling across her cheek. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't speak. She didn't kneel. The townsfolk sat frozen. No one breathed. Not the banker's wife with her gloved hands. Not the young men in pressed shirts and stolen boots. Not even the sheriff, who stood at the back with a toothpick in his mouth and a look that meant he wouldn't interfere. Not for her. It was a trial without defense. A verdict without law. They called it discipline. They said she'd led the pastor's son into sin. That she'd corrupted a God-fearing boy with Apache witchery. That she'd come from the mountains with spirits in her blood and a smile too sharp for innocence. They didn't know she'd been the one who said no. They didn't want to. The boy was gone by then. Sent off to Tucson, or maybe farther. Somewhere safe, away from whispers. They kept his name clean, and hers buried. Maria had stood in the back pew when they summoned her to the altar. She walked alone, steps even, chin high. No mother to follow, no hand to hold. The slap came without warning. She didn't flinch. After the silence came the murmurs. She was unrepentant. She was proud. She had no shame. And when they told her to kneel, to ask forgiveness, she stood straight and said nothing. She wouldn't give them her voice. Later that night, 3 men came to the little cabin where she and her grandmother lived. They didn't knock. They didn't wait. The old woman tried to stop them, but they threw her to the ground and pushed past. Maria didn't scream. By morning, the house was empty. Her grandmother found the red wrap burned in the hearth, the beaded moccasins torn and left by the door. There was blood on the floor, a thin trail leading out to the mesquite trees. No one came when the old woman cried. The sheriff filed no report. The preacher gave no sermon. The town moved on, heads turned, ears closed. A week later, someone dug a shallow grave by the rocks outside town. No one saw who did it. No one asked. The word appeared on the stone a day after. Sinner, carved in a rage that wasn't hers. The boy who had watched from the ridge didn't know her name. He only knew the old woman from the edge of the village who used to trade herbs for bullets. She had braided his hair once, long ago, and called him Toshli, little fox. He had come to the grave out of instinct. He knew something had been taken. He just didn't know what. When he saw the cowboy dig, he didn't run. He watched, quiet. When their eyes met, he lifted his hand in respect, not for the man, but for the girl he didn't know. He ran back through the brush, feet light on the stone. He would tell his uncle, the others. Someone had disturbed the sleeping earth, but not in desecration, in care. Caleb rode into the trading post by sundown. Dust clung to the sweat in his shirt. The building was half adobe, half timber, tucked between 2 ravines with just enough flat ground for wagons to turn. A sign hung crooked above the door, letters worn thin. Fitch and Co. Trading. Dry goods, ammo, salt, cloth. He tied the horse, pulled the red sash from his coat, and folded it into his satchel. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco, tallow soap, and grain. The merchant behind the counter was pale, mid-50s, with one eye slightly lazy, and a way of talking like he'd just finished spitting. "You're late in the season," he said. "Storms'll hit in 2 weeks. You headed north?" "Not sure yet," Caleb replied. "You Apache?" "No." "Then stay that way," the man muttered, tossing a handful of dried beans into a scale. "They're restless again. Something stirred them." Caleb didn't answer. He placed the torn cloth scrap and the rusted earring on the counter. The merchant raised an eyebrow. "Where'd you get that?" "Trade," Caleb said. The man leaned in. "That's mescalero work, from the East Mountains. That earring's older. Not made for trade. Made for keeping. Know who wore it?" "No." The man glanced around, lowered his voice. "But if it came from that girl, you best toss it in a fire. Folks don't like her name spoken. I didn't say her name. You didn't have to." Caleb picked up the earring, turned it over in his palm, and slipped it back into his coat. He left without buying anything. Outside he paused. There were eyes on him, from the saloon porch, from the upstairs window of the lodging house, from the old man sitting silent beside the well. They didn't say a word, but they knew what he carried. He mounted the horse and turned back toward the desert, back toward the stone. He wasn't done yet. They had dropped her ribbon into the well 2 nights after the burial. The girl's last possession. Red silk, knotted at one end. Stained. No ceremony. Just a hand that tossed it in while no one was watching. Let it sink into black water where no truth floats. The well stood behind the abandoned mission house, on the edge of town where the brush grew thick and the wind whispered names that didn't belong to white mouths. The boards creaked with every gust. A door swung open, then shut, over and over. No one used the mission anymore, not since she stopped coming. Caleb returned under night sky, the moon a thin crescent caught in the throat of 2 clouds. He didn't ride up. He left the horse tied behind the ridge and walked the rest of the way on foot, steps silent, eyes sharp. He circled the well once, slow. It was old. Stone-built, dry rope pulley system, bucket cracked in 2 at the bottom. But water still ran below. He could hear it, or maybe he just wanted to. He knelt beside it and lowered a lantern. The flame flickered against the dark stone, sending shadows dancing down the shaft. At the bottom, something moved. He pulled the rope up. No bucket. Just the weight of silence, and then wet cloth, the ribbon. Faded now, darker than blood, heavy with water. He held it in his hands for a long time, dripping between his fingers. There were voices inside the old mission, muffled, low. He pushed the door open. 2 men sat at a table built from old pews. One was the preacher's eldest, Joseph Tate. Clean hands, clean teeth, a face that never aged past 17. The other was Sheriff Kern, sleeves rolled, gun on the table beside his coffee cup. They didn't flinch. "You're lost, cowboy," Kern said without standing. "Or you're hunting ghosts." "Didn't know ghosts drank coffee," Caleb answered. Tate leaned back, fingers laced behind his head. "If you're looking for answers, they're buried." "So was she," Caleb said, tossing the ribbon on the table. It landed with a wet slap. Kern's hand twitched toward his pistol, then stopped. "Where'd you get that?" Tate asked, voice still casual, but his eyes flickered. "Same place you threw her name?" "Down a hole." Kern stood slowly. "You're not from here. You don't know how things are." Caleb looked around the ruined chapel, the dust on the altar, the warped hymn books, the candle stubs. "Seems like I do." Tate sat up, elbows on the table now. "She wasn't what you think. She fooled people. Dressed quiet, smiled soft, but she twisted the boy's mind." "You mean your brother?" Tate's face stiffened. He was young. So was she. Kern stepped closer. "You come here with pieces of cloth and some hero's guilt, thinking you'll fix something. You can't. This town buried her for a reason." "No," Caleb said, stepping back toward the door, voice low. "You buried her to forget your reason." And then he was gone. He didn't go far. Behind the mission, near the corral ruins, a figure stood between 2 fence posts. Still. Watching. It was the boy again, the same one from the ridge. Barefoot. Eyes sharp. This time, he held something. A bundle of paper, tied in string. Charred at the corners. He walked up to Caleb and held it out. "From her grandmother," the boy said. First words he'd spoken. Caleb took it carefully. The boy didn't wait. He turned and ran into the dark, leaving only dust and the faint sound of hoofbeats far off, like memory returning. At camp that night, Caleb lit a small fire and opened the bundle. Inside were drawings, pages of them, charcoal sketches of hills, animals, faces. Careful hands had shaded the curve of a cheek, the glint in a horse's eye, the wind in a woman's hair. One sketch was different. A girl kneeling by a stream, head down, hands open. But she wasn't praying. She was washing something. Blood from her dress. A ribbon lay beside her. Beneath the sketch, faint writing in Apache syllables. He didn't read them, but he traced them with his finger. He stared at that drawing long into the night, the fire burning low. In the silence, the picture spoke louder than any voice. At dawn, he rode east, away from the town, toward the hills, toward the place where the mountains begin to rise like broken teeth and the sky stops pretending to care. He knew who had carved the word on the stone now. He also knew it wasn't true. She had not sinned. She had refused, and they had buried her for it. The hills held stories no map could find. Caleb rode through narrow canyons where dust collected in old hoofprints, and nothing moved unless it had to. He followed the land's memory, burned shrubs, broken stones, trees that bent in one direction as if leaning toward a name they had once heard. He wasn't hunting justice. He was following a ghost that never called itself one. By the second day, he found it. A stream, narrow and fast, cut through the rocks. On its bank the grass grew wild, taller than his knee. A scattering of obsidian flakes told him someone had camped there, worked, eaten, waited. He dismounted and stepped into the clearing. There was no trail, but there were signs. A shawl half buried in mud, patterned with red and turquoise thread. Charred stone ring from a long cold fire. Ashes washed thin by rain, yet still present. Someone had lived here long enough to leave behind more than prints. He crouched and brushed dirt from the shawl. Apache weaving. The same hands that had sewn the sash. He turned toward the largest boulder near the water's edge. Its surface bore scratches, weathered but deliberate. A spiral carved in careful lines, mescalero sign for memory or return. Beneath it, fainter symbols. Apache syllabary. He couldn't read them, but he traced the markings with his fingers like they could still warm from the touch of her hand. A few steps away, a bundle of bones lay tucked in the grass. Small, fragile, picked clean, not animal. He knelt, breath held, picked up what remained of a necklace, leather cord, broken, with 2 blue beads still intact. Then he saw the drawing, half tucked under a stone, charcoal on hide. A girl kneeling by the stream, washing her hands, a ribbon beside her. This wasn't where she died. It was where she chose to live for a while. Alone, quiet, not hiding, surviving. He gathered the bones gently, wrapped them in the shawl, and sat beside the fire pit until night. He lit no fire. The stars didn't need help shining that night. He buried her before dawn. Not under the town's hateful stone, not beneath lies. He found a ledge that faced the valley, overlooking the same canyon she had drawn. The grave was shallow, but clean. He lined it with pine needles, laid the bones carefully, the necklace in her palm, then placed the wrapped drawing over her chest. On top, he set a stone, smooth, unmarked, except for a spiral etched at its center, and he whispered one name, Maria. 3 days later, he returned to the town, not by road. He came in from the hills, quiet as fog, coat dusty, boots crusted in red clay. He passed no one on the way to the square, but he felt their eyes. They were always watching, just not where it mattered. By the well, he stood and waited. People gathered. The sheriff, Tate, the merchant, the preacher's wife in her pale shawl. Whispers circled like buzzards. Then Caleb knelt and laid 2 things on the ground. The ribbon, now clean, still damp from the stream, and the drawing. Tate stepped forward. You think this changes anything? Caleb didn't rise. He looked at the crowd. She didn't need to be forgiven. She needed to be heard. He placed the necklace beside the paper. Blue beads caught the sun. She washed blood off her hands, not because it was hers, but because it was yours. Tate's lip curled. She was warned. No, Caleb said, standing. She was punished for refusing to kneel to men who used the cross to cover their shame. The silence after that lasted longer than the sheriff's patience. You need to leave this town, Cowboy, Kern said. I already did, Caleb replied. But first I came back, to leave her in the right place. He turned and walked. No one followed. They didn't stop him, because they knew. Deep down, behind every folded hand and pious eye, they all knew. He returned to her grave that night. The wind had shifted, quieter, warmer. At the base of the new stone, he left the drawing, anchored with the necklace. Not for her. She remembered everything, but so the land would too. The storm came without thunder. No warning, no dark sky, just wind, low and sharp, like breath drawn through clenched teeth. It bent the mesquite trees eastward and sent dust spiraling through the chapel ruins. By noon, it had buried the footprints in the square. The town turned inward, doors locked, shutters barred. The preacher didn't speak that morning. The sheriff stayed in his office longer than usual, and the schoolteacher, who had once braided Maria's hair during a harvest gathering, told her pupils not to ask about the past. But silence isn't peace. It's a heat that builds from underneath, slow, dry, invisible, until it cracks the surface. Behind the saloon, a group of boys found the charcoal sketch. It was folded beneath a broken crate near the back wall where no one swept. A girl beside a stream, her hands in water, a ribbon on the rocks. They didn't recognize her face, not fully, but one boy touched the corner of the page, then tucked it into his vest. He didn't tell his parents. That night, he left a flower by the well. Up in the hills, the fire burned slow. It wasn't Caleb's. Across a low ridge, 2 mescalero men built a morning blaze, not for a body, but for memory. They stood beside the flame in silence, wrapped in hides, their faces marked with ash and clay. No words, only firelight and breath. They had come after word spread. Quiet word, not written, not said in town. A boy had run, a boy who had seen the cowboy dig beside the grave, a boy who carried bones in silence until they reached the right ears. Now, the fire climbed high. Caleb stood at a distance near a thorn bush. He hadn't asked to be part of it. He only watched. The older of the 2 men stepped toward him after a while. He carried something wrapped in cloth, a bundle, tightly folded. He set it on the ground between them. "For her," he said. Caleb nodded. The younger man, not much older than the boy from the ridge, said softly, "We didn't know where she went. She didn't want to be found," Caleb said, "but she wanted to be remembered." They let the fire answer. In the town, the preacher's wife stood at the well. Her hands clutched the ribbon, red silk, clean, pressed flat, as if returned from some place far too gentle for what had happened. No note, no name. Just the ribbon, left on her porch in the blue hour before dawn. She remembered the first time she had touched it. Maria had come to her with a cramp in her belly, afraid, cheeks flushed with heat and shame. She had sat her down, brewed herbs, washed her hands. The girl hadn't spoken much, but when she left, she smiled, and the ribbon was tied tight in her braid. Now the woman stood alone at the well, fingers trembling. She loosened her grip. The ribbon slipped from her hand and fell. It caught the wind, danced once, then dropped into the dark. She didn't look down. The sheriff found Caleb again 2 days later. He was sitting outside the old mission, hat low, sharpening a blade on stone. Nothing threatening, just routine, like someone preparing for a long trail. Kern dismounted and sat beside him without invitation. "You think this changes anything?" he asked. "No," Caleb said, still dragging the blade. "They'll forget. These people forget fast. I didn't come to make them remember." The sheriff waited. Caleb stopped sharpening, looked at the knife, then at the dirt. "I just didn't want her to stay buried with a lie." Kern sighed. "You've stirred up talk. Talk's better than silence." "Not around here." Caleb placed the blade into the sheath. "That's why I'm leaving." "You always were," the sheriff muttered. "You're the kind of man who never stays." "No one ever stayed for her," Caleb said. "Not when it mattered." Kern stood up, dusted his hands, looked toward the hills. Then, softer than expected, "She was kind. I remember that." Caleb nodded once. Kern left, without shaking hands. That night, in the chapel, someone lit a candle. Just one. It flickered on the altar, throwing light on a glass-covered sketch. The girl by the stream, the ribbon beside her, her hands open, not praying, just being. Someone had pressed an owl feather into the crack in the wood below it, and beside the drawing, a stone. No name. But her face stayed. Out in the desert, under a moon too thin to illuminate anything clearly, Caleb packed his saddle. He carried little, the drawing she left behind, the beads, the stone with the spiral. In his coat pocket, the stitched red sash. He didn't wear it. He just carried it, like a question still unanswered. The fire beneath their silence hadn't burned out. It had only begun to breathe. The boy came alone. At first light, before even the roosters stirred in town, he crossed the ridge barefoot, his steps soft on the dewless earth. In one hand, he carried a jar of water. In the other, a stone painted with ochre, smooth and oval, like something meant to fit into a palm and stay there. He reached the grave as the sun cut a line across the valley floor. The two stones stood side by side. One still bore the word, sinner, now worn, but not removed. The other, the newer one, had no name. Only a spiral carved in the center and a faded owl feather tied around the base. He sat, not to pray, just to be near. He poured the water carefully at the base of the new stone, watching it darken the earth like ink. Then he set the ochre stone beside it. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Far behind him, the town remained quiet. But change, like weather, begins where no one is watching. The chapel doors no longer stayed locked. A woman now swept the floor every morning, slowly, as if each corner deserved remembering. Someone had left a wrapped bundle of bread at the well. Another had laid sage at the foot of the saloon steps. No one talked about her. But she had never needed words to be known. Caleb rode south. He didn't look back often. But that morning, as he crossed into the broken hills, he paused. The trail ahead was dry. Rocks jutted through the dust like knuckles. A hawk wheeled overhead. Quiet. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the red sash. Still clean, still warm from the sun. He didn't wrap it around his neck. He didn't wear it on his arm. He tied it to the branch of a dead juniper. It fluttered once, and stayed. He dismounted, removed his hat, and laid it on the stone beneath the tree. He kept walking after that, hatless, westward, toward land where no one knew her name, where the wind didn't carry it, but the silence still honored it. He carried nothing that marked him anymore, only a slower gait, a different breath, and a face that no longer looked away. Back at the grave, the boy returned 3 times in the same month. Each time he brought something. The first visit, a pouch of cornmeal. The second, a drawing of a girl, standing now, holding a feather. The third time he brought nothing. He just sat, hat pulled low, knees tucked in. And he cried, not loud, not for long, but with the kind of cry that leaves the body changed. The sheriff never visited. But one morning, a stone appeared beside the chapel door. It bore no message, only a carved mark, a spiral. People began using the well again, slowly, cautiously, as if drawing water required permission. Children ran past it without fear, and the woman with the shawl, preacher's wife, began baking again. She never spoke of the girl, but every Friday she left a small loaf by the path near the ridge, wrapped in red cloth. Seasons passed. Grass grew around the stones. The word sinner faded, not erased, just less loud. The spiral remained, clear, unmoving, like the truth. Caleb was never seen again. But years later, a man with no hat and quiet eyes was spotted near the Pecos, helping rebuild a collapsed barn after a summer flood. He didn't say where he was from, only asked for a shovel. When he left, he gave the young girl who had brought him water a drawing, a stream, a ribbon, and hands, open, not pleading, just being. The girl kept it in a wooden box for many years, and when she was old enough, she passed it on. No name, no story, just silence that meant something. Years later, the path to the ridge was still visible, though narrower now, softened by moss and time. The stones in the old cemetery seemed to sleep beneath the weight of decades and unspoken promises. Life in the valley had shifted, as life always does, but the air at that high point remained still, as if honoring something sacred buried there. The girl grew up, became a woman, then a mother, and later, alone again. She never spoke of the man with no hat, but she kept the drawing like a passed-down secret, one not meant to be told, only lived. One morning, with hair silvered by age, she returned to the ridge with her granddaughter. She didn't say where they were going. She just asked the girl to bring flowers. "Why?" the girl asked. "Because some things need to be remembered, even if we don't understand them," the grandmother said. Up there, the two mounds still stood side by side. Time had smoothed the wood, but the spiral remained. The word sinner was now barely legible, as if the world had slowly learned not to shout so loudly. The girl laid the flowers, white, simple, and stood in silence beside her grandmother. "Was she your mother?" the girl asked. The woman shook her head. "No, but she taught me how to become one." Far below, in town, the chapel bell rang on its own. The rope had snapped years ago, but the wind, the same wind that carried silences and memories, made it sing sometimes, as if remembrance didn't need permission. In the square, a new generation played without knowing the story, but their laughter seemed freer. The town's old fountain, restored, poured clear, steady water. And someone had painted a mural on the school wall, warm colors, a field, a bird, and in the center, a woman with a feather in her hair and her eyes closed, as if listening to the world from the inside. No one signed it, but everyone knew who it was. One day, the boy, now grown, with graying beard and gentle eyes, returned to the valley. He didn't seek anyone. He walked straight to the ridge, where the 2 stones still stood. In his hands, he carried an old wooden box, the same one. He took out the drawing, yellowed by time, but intact. He placed it between the stones, protected by glass, covered by a small wooden shrine he built himself. Then he sat, like before, like always. He stayed until the sun dropped low and the shadows stretched long, and the earth felt more like dream than ground. When he stood, he left one last offering, a feather, white, unblemished.